Hey guys, tonight we are going to uncover the terrifying secret behind the greatest legend in English history, the story of Queen Elizabeth I, also known as the Virgin Queen. It is often said that history is written by the victors, but the truth is buried by the survivors. And sometimes, the dead keep secrets better than the living. What happens when a decomposing body, lying deep beneath Westminster Abbey, holds a power greater than any army England ever fielded? This is not the story you already know, about the courageous queen who stood against the Spanish Armada. This is the story of the price of immortality, a tale of slowly poisoning oneself with lead to maintain a perfect complexion, of a steel corset that crushed internal organs, and of a concealed medical secret that could have brought down the entire empire. Elizabeth I survived everything, but her death standing up, refusing to lie down, serves as the ultimate proof of the devastation she embraced to become an icon. We will open the files on the room that reeked of death, the whispers of her ladies-in-waiting, and the reason why her skeleton has remained sealed for 400 years. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is, your local time. It helps me imagine all of us relaxing together from all over the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. On the 24th of March in the year 1603, Queen Elizabeth Tudor died at the age of 69, yet official history has hidden the truth. She did not perish peacefully in her silken bed, but stood upright, refusing to lie down for week after week, her eyes wide open, following shadows only she could see. In Richmond Palace, the odour was not the familiar scent of illness, but the vivid stench of rotting flesh, an aroma that blurred every perfume, shattered incense bundles, and spread like a living creature. The surroundings felt suffocating, as if trapped in a dreamless slumber. Servants stood vigil around her each night, kneeling on the cold, stone floor, their trembling hands barely able to smooth the silk at her shoulders. Courtiers frantically burned incense and scattered lavender petals across the wooden boards, but the rising fragrance was silently cut off by the smell of death, contracting and then vanishing. The air in the chamber pressed heavily, like a toxic mist, driving one to flee even as one's own gasps for breath held them in place. Elizabeth, who once commanded thousands with a single glance, now resembled a ghost trapped within her own flesh. Every step she took required a servant's support, a fragile balance that could shatter like a flickering candle's flame. Her face, once radiant by candlelight and masked by a thick layer of lead-white paste, was now cracked, revealing thin, bruised, and parched skin beneath. Her unblinking eyes stared into nothingness, as if awaiting something that could not be named. In the gloom, the wind whistling through carved wooden shutters whispered, "The Queen, the Queen." Yet no one dared draw near to hear more clearly. The physicians, who had treated her with costly remedies and ancient methods, stood mute in a corner, their eyes reflecting helplessness. They dared not lift the draperies sealing her body, nor remove her lavish garments or precious jewels. All examination was forbidden, for a queen must never reveal her body to common eyes. Thus, for many weeks, her corpse lay exposed in the magnificent chamber, the scents of perfume and decay locked in daily conflict. Servants scrubbed endlessly. The velvet and silk that draped her bed were replaced in layers, yet the trembling fissures in her body could not be concealed. Day by day, some attendants collapsed in exhaustion, nauseated by the overwhelming odour of death. They would slink away into dark corridors, clasping their hands in prayer that her spirit might soon escape that earthly hell. Elizabeth's demise was not merely the parting of soul and body. It was a tragic performance spanning many weeks, harbouring a painful secret so terrible it had to be sealed in lead for 4 centuries. As her frame soaked in the wounds of disease, her ravaged form left even master physicians powerless, and lies swiftly supplanted reality. Beneath the layers of silk and regal jewels, no one was permitted to unveil, examine, or disclose the truth. Elizabeth died slowly, died horribly, and her corpse became the most vivid testament to the formidable power of buried secrets. To understand the tragedy of her death, we must travel back to 1536, when Elizabeth was not yet 3 years old. In that year, she heard the roar of the crowd gathered around the execution scaffold, and then the sudden hush before the thud of her mother's head falling. Anne Boleyn, the woman who had severed England's ties with Rome and met a wronged and violent end. Although the child was not permitted to witness the moment herself, the sound of the axe striking wood and the gasp of the spectators etched itself into her young mind. In that instant, Elizabeth learned her first lessons of power. Weakness would kill her. Being born a woman would kill her. Needing anyone would kill her. The court of Henry VIII was far less a palace and far more a slaughterhouse. One might be elevated to queen in the morning, condemned for treason by midday, and led to execution by dinner time. In this atmosphere of sudden reversals and relentless danger, Elizabeth watched quietly, observing how each of Henry's wives met her fate. Anne of Cleves, discarded yet shrewd enough to slip away from the scaffold unscathed, demonstrated the value of strategic submission. Catherine Howard, too youthful and too foolish to guard her words and actions, paid with her life at the age of 21. Catherine Parr, careful and cautious, survived by remaining nearly invisible, speaking when necessary but never more. These examples formed a harsh curriculum for the little princess. The first lesson: a single misstep could cost one's head. The deeper lesson: as a woman in that court, she was always perched on the edge of an executioner's block. Each queen's rise and fall whispered to Elizabeth that she must become someone unassailable, someone who would never be seen to falter. In her small, silent world, the cruelty of those events became the guiding principle of her survival. As Elizabeth grew older, her observations deepened into strategies. She learned to mask her emotions, to sculpt her public persona with the same precision as a sculptor chiseling marble. She practiced the art of strategic silence, speaking only when her words would gain her advantage or avert suspicion. She cultivated an image of obedience, humility, and intellectual depth, studying Latin, Greek, and philosophy, so that no one could accuse her of frivolous womanhood. When her half-brother Edward ascended the throne at the age of 9, she buried her personal convictions beneath a veneer of compliance, attending Protestant services and reading scripture, offering no quarrel for the zealots to burn. Yet the memory of her mother's death haunted her. Elizabeth never forgot the whispered rumours that Catherine Howard had been too vocal, had laughed too freely, had seemed too eager to belong. She internalized the belief that a woman's voice was a dangerous weapon, one that might be used against her. She studied the expressions and demeanours of the courtiers, cataloguing who seemed sincere, who flickered with ambition, and who would betray at the slightest pressure. All the while, she remained deliberately inscrutable, her face often powdered, and her expressions carefully controlled. The endless parade of matrimonial negotiations taught her a further lesson. Marriage could be a tool or a trap, depending on how one wielded it. Each proposed suitor represented a geopolitical pawn, but also a potential source of vulnerability. Elizabeth watched envoys arrive with grand promises, only to vanish when alliances shifted. She learned to prolong negotiations indefinitely, stringing along princes who might protect her but also might overpower her. Through it all, she maintained her autonomy, ensuring that no single marriage alliance could compromise her authority. Behind that calm, calculating exterior, the young princess harboured a private determination. Never again would she be powerless or dependent. The memory of her mother's execution instilled in her an unshakable resolve to remain untouchable, to become an embodiment of strength that no rumour, no scandal, no political conspiracy could destroy. In the silence of her private chambers, she rehearsed the expressions of gentleness and grace she would display in public, masking the steel beneath. Thus the seeds of Elizabeth's reign were sown in that moment of childhood horror. The cruelty of the scaffold and the rotting spectre of her mother's death became a blueprint for survival. She would rise above the brutality, she would weaponize her own image, and she would forge an identity so potent that even death itself would tremble before her memory. In learning from the fates of those around her, she prepared herself to face the ultimate test, ruling a kingdom world, weary of conflict, yet still hungry for stability, in an age where a single misstep could bring a monarch to ruin. Bennett among the fallen queens, Elizabeth resolved to stand unbowed, an unwavering sentinel in the corridors of power, forever guided by the echo of that distant axe. In the year 1536, after Henry VIII had wed his fifth wife, young Elizabeth, though branded a bastard, harboured no bitterness. She inclined her head in gratitude and offered a gentle smile, all the while recording in her mind who had betrayed her who had maintained silence, and who might serve her purposes in the years to come. Even at that tender age, she devoted herself to the study of Latin, Greek, philosophy, and foreign tongues, determined to become more valuable for her intellect than any rival queen could be for her beauty. By 1547, when her half-brother Edward ascended the throne at the age of 9, Elizabeth mastered the art of discretion. She concealed her convictions behind a mask of compliance, attending the new Protestant services without complaint, offering no accusation, and giving her detractors no cause to question her loyalty. Yet her silence was a strategy, a conscious choice to avoid entanglement, until she could discern who wielded power and how it might be turned to her advantage. When her sister Mary came to power and unleashed the fury of the Marian persecutions, burning hundreds of Protestants at the stake, Elizabeth's world darkened as she found herself imprisoned in the very Tower of London where her mother had once awaited her own unjust death. For 2 months, she endured unrelenting interrogations, each day bringing the threat of the scaffold. Scholars might call it questioning, but to Elizabeth it was the slow tightening of a noose. Every question was a test, every pause in the interrogator's tone a signal of impending doom. Yet Elizabeth survived not by theology or by birthright, but by performance. At the precise moments when her keepers demanded emotional display, she presented a facade of exhaustion and contrition, occasionally weeping with timely sincerity. Her tears convinced Mary's council that to execute her would yield political calamity, martyrdom, and rebellion rather than silence. In those harrowing weeks, Elizabeth learned that true power lay in adopting whatever persona others required: penitent daughter, loyal subject, broken victim. It was a lesson that would shape her rule. She realized that identity could be malleable, that the same face set in stone one day could, with a subtle shift of expression, become the embodiment of resolve the next. She observed the faces of her interrogators, noting which of them softened at her tears, which stiffened at her gentleness, which wavered at her humility. Each discovery was carefully catalogued in her mind, stored away like precious scrolls in a royal library. When she was released from the Tower, Elizabeth bore no resentment. Instead, she carried the scars of survival as badges of honor. She understood that offending the wrong person could end a life, while pleasing a greater power could spare it. Thus, she refined her talents in rhetoric and deportment. She selected her words with the precision of a surgeon, speaking only when an advantage could be gained or a threat averted. She honed her posture, her glance, her subtle nod, recognizing that a queen's smallest gesture could send ripples through the court and across Europe. During these years of peril and pretense, Elizabeth's studies in philosophy and the classics deepened. She drew from Cicero's counsel on civic duty and from Aristotle's assertions on the ethical life. She practiced composition in Latin and Greek, crafting letters that conveyed loyalty to Mary, yet hinted at her own endurance. In private hours, by candlelight, she translated philosophical treatises into English, seeding her mind with tenets of governance, justice, and human nature that would inform her later decrees. By the time Mary's reign ended and Elizabeth stepped into her sister's shoes as monarch, she was not the same child who had arrived at court. She had transformed her vulnerabilities into strengths, her forced performances into an arsenal of statecraft. She had become the consummate actor on the stage of power, capable of wearing any mask the moment demanded. And she had learned that the ultimate mask must never slip. The face of the sovereign must remain an enduring symbol, untroubled by doubts or discomfort. In accepting her new role, Elizabeth knew that the lessons etched into her memory during those 2 months of imprisonment would be her guiding stars. She would navigate the treacherous waters of international politics, religious conflict, and domestic intrigue with the same calculated grace that had spared her life. And although she would face fresh trials, none would be as elemental as the first learning that a queen's survival depended not on brute force or dynastic claim, but on the power to become precisely what every rival, every counsellor, and every executioner feared or desired. Thus, from her earliest days of forced obeisance and careful tears, Elizabeth forged the foundation of her reign. The sovereign's greatest weapon is the ability to shape perception itself, to play each role with such conviction that even the harshest critics cannot discern the woman within the crown. In that alchemy of adaptation, she found not only safety, but the secret of lasting sovereignty. In the year 1558, Mary died childless, and Elizabeth ascended the throne at the age of 25. The coronation was a spectacle of gold and light. She rode through London atop a white horse, cloaked in cloth of gold, the streets lined with cheering crowds. Yet, beneath the jubilant veneer, Elizabeth carried within her the hardened fear forged by decades of cruelty. She must never display so much as a tremor of weakness. From the moment she donned the crown, pressure mounted from all sides. Her council and parliament demanded a husband and heir to secure the Tudor line. Thus began the parade of suitors. Philip II of Spain, who offered military protection but risked dragging England into continental wars. Archduke Charles of Austria, whose vast empire made him a dangerous protector. Eric of Sweden, whose flattery and painted portraits were amusing to the Queen's ladies but perilous in their political implications. The Duke of Anjou of France, whose Catholic faith risked a Protestant backlash. Elizabeth skirted each proposal with artful diplomacy, neither accepting nor fully rejecting, so as to avoid insulting any power while preserving her own freedom. Amid these diplomatic dances emerged Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, her childhood friend and the one man who held her genuine affection. When his wife died mysteriously in 1660, rumours swirled that he had orchestrated the tragedy to clear a path to marry the Queen. Despite the scandal, Elizabeth kept Dudley close. She conferred upon him noble titles, granted him vast estates, and allowed him privileged access to her presence. Their relationship became a public enigma, driving foreign ambassadors to distraction as they attempted to discern whether the Queen would finally choose love over politics. All the while, Elizabeth guarded a deeply personal secret. She could not bear children. She never experienced the monthly cycles of other women, and her physique, tall and broad-shouldered, combined with her unusually low voice, set her apart from expectations of femininity in a queen. Every potential marriage offered the risk that her inability to conceive would become open knowledge, undermining her legitimacy and exposing her vulnerability. To safeguard her throne, she constructed a narrative of deliberate virginity. She would remain the Virgin Queen, devoted solely to her country, a consummate symbol rather than a woman of flesh and blood. In public appearances, this image was meticulously maintained. Elizabeth adopted a persona of measured poise, a deliberate tilt of the head here, a carefully timed smile there, gestures that conveyed both warmth and regal distance. At state receptions, she would stand for hours in her ornate gowns and heavy jewellery, never permitting signs of fatigue or discomfort to show. Court painters captured her likeness again and again, as an ageless icon portraits in which her skin remained flawless, her hair unblemished, her eyes bright. Behind closed doors, however, the demands took their toll. The corsets laced around her torso compressed her ribs and made every breath a labour, a necessary torture to preserve the silhouette of power. Heavy wigs piled high on her head, weighed on her neck, and caused persistent headaches. The perfumes and powders she applied daily, often containing mercury and lead, masked the ravages of stress and age while slowly poisoning her from within. Yet these sacrifices were never acknowledged. They were simply the price of immortality in the eyes of her subjects. Elizabeth's council observed her carefully. Any hint of weakness, a tremor in her hand, a hesitation in her speech, would be reported to foreign courts by the very ambassadors she had kept guessing. Spies and informants circulated rumours about her health and potential marriage plans, hoping for leverage. In response, Elizabeth cultivated an aura of inscrutability. She often spoke in riddles, allowed negotiations to drag on for years, and used silence as a weapon. Ambassadors left her presence bewildered, unsure whether she was teasing them or testing their resolve. In this crucible of politics and performance, Elizabeth honed her greatest skill, the ability to read a room and adapt instantly to its needs. She learned to offer comfort or command respect with equal facility. When Parliament pressed her for an heir, she delivered eloquent speeches on the burdens of single rule. When foreign factions urged alliance through marriage, she responded with courteous promises to consider the matter. Each answer was calibrated to maintain her sovereignty while deflecting demands. Through these masterstrokes of statecraft, Elizabeth transformed her personal limitations into pillars of her authority. Her virginity became a symbol of undivided loyalty to England. Her refusal to marry conveyed strength rather than deficiency. In her reign, she would never allow the private realities of her body or her fears to eclipse the public myth of her invincibility. Thus, by embracing the intricate dance of power, she ensured that no foreign prince, no jealous court faction, and no scandal could ever seize the throne she had claimed. And so, as the crowds roared and the trumpets blared at her coronation, Elizabeth rode unflinching through the streets, carrying within her the silent resolve born of countless memories. The bitter lesson that a queen must always be more than human, always immune to pain or pity, always the final arbiter of her own destiny. The secret of Elizabeth's body remains conjecture to this day. Many historians suggest she suffered from androgen insensitivity syndrome or another intersex condition, appearing outwardly female yet lacking functional reproductive organs. To conceal this truth, she adopted the Venetian Suze regimen, a daily mask of white lead and arsenic applied in thick layers, transforming her visage into flawless porcelain. Unbeknownst to the cheering crowds, those lethal metals seeped through her skin into her bloodstream, accumulating in her bones and brain. Over decades, the toxins exacted a devastating toll. Chronic headaches that felled her in council meetings, abdominal cramps that left her hunched in agony, joint pain so severe she mastered courtly dances only by sheer force of will, and progressive kidney and liver failure that made each breath a struggle. As the years wore on, observers noted increasingly erratic behavior, moments of confusion in diplomatic audiences, sharp mood swings that startled her ladies in waiting, and bouts of insomnia that had her pacing the corridors by candlelight. Rumours hinted at occasional memory lapses, as if she could not recall discussions of the day before. Her teeth yellowed and crumbled, victims of both lead poisoning and the sweetness of her courtly diet, yet she refused any remedy that might suggest weakness. Instead, she stuffed cotton into her cheeks to preserve the illusion of youthful fullness, even as her jaw trembled with pain. Worse still was the corsetry she imposed on herself. To maintain the rigid silhouette expected of a Tudor queen, a narrow waist, elevated torso, she laced her corsets tighter than any woman at court dared. Reinforced with whalebone and steel, the garment compressed her ribs inward over the decades, deforming her chest cavity and displacing her internal organs. On most days, she could stand only by leaning against walls or by sitting upon cushions piled high to relieve pressure. Even then, the discomfort was relentless. Breathing shallow, her lungs unable to expand fully, digestion agonizing, as her stomach and intestines were forced into cramped quarters, and her spine gradually curving under the unnatural posture enforced by the steel stays. Each public appearance became a test of endurance, a performance of stoic regality masking a body in revolt. At state banquets, she would stand for hours in gowns embroidered with gold thread and draped in velvet, her attendants strategically placed behind her to catch any sign of collapse and to offer a quick cushion should she falter. During audiences with ambassadors, she projected an aura of unassailable command, her voice resonant and unwavering, hiding the strain in her chords from years of lead exposure. The interplay between makeup and misery created a vicious cycle. The more the white Suze cracked and revealed crusted sores, the thicker her ladies applied the next layer. Each new application of lead and arsenic further eroded her skin's natural defenses, causing open wounds that oozed beneath her mask. To cover these lesions, they built the paste even higher, inadvertently accelerating tissue necrosis. And so, what began as an effort to achieve an otherworldly radiance turned into a daily torture ritual, each application a small dose of poison, administered in the name of political survival. By the time the final months of her life arrived, Elizabeth's tortured flesh and distorted bones could no longer bear the charade. On the 24th of March in the year 1603, when she finally succumbed, the layers of makeup flaked away in great sheets, revealing mottled flesh blackened by years of chronic poisoning. Beneath, the corset's indentations were etched deeply into her torso, like the fossil imprint of some monstrous creature. Her ribs protruded through torn fabric, cracked and bent, evidence of the steel cage she had worn for decades. As the first pallbearers removed her lavish vestments, a rancid odor of decay flooded the chamber, overpowering every incense burner and perfumed cushion. It was a stench that spoke of organ failure, of festering wounds, of lead-inflicted madness. No perfume could mask it, no window could dispel it. Those who witnessed the unveiling recoiled in horror. One lady-in-waiting fainted at the sight, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the secret laid bare. That night, courtiers moved swiftly to contain the scandal. Elizabeth's corpse was wrapped in lead-lined cloth and sealed within a coffin, entombed in the vault of Westminster Abbey before the true extent of her decay could become diplomatic ammunition. Under orders from her successor, the vault door was barred, the keys dispersed among loyal nobles, and any record of her autopsy suppressed. Thus, the final act in her long tragedy was to bury the evidence in lead, preserving the myth of the Virgin Queen at the cost of consigning her tormented body and the truth of her suffering to 4 centuries of silence. The years 1560 through 1570 proved Elizabeth's greatest trial, the arrival of Mary, Queen of Scots, her cousin and most formidable rival. In 1568, Mary landed on English soil, fleeing rebellion in Scotland, accompanied by her husband Lord Darnley and her infant son James, heir to both thrones. To Catholic Europe she embodied legitimate monarchy, a princess born of a lawful union, an anointed sovereign, while Elizabeth remained the bastard daughter of a marriage condemned by the papacy. Every Catholic plot whispered Mary's name. In 1571, the Ridolfi plot aimed to depose Elizabeth and crown Mary, backed by the Duke of Norfolk and Spanish gold. Then came the Throckmorton conspiracy of 1583, a scheme to unite Spanish forces with English rebels to kidnap the Queen and enthrone her cousin. And at the height of intrigue, the Babington plot of 1586 sought to poison Elizabeth's wine, then smuggle Mary free from captivity so she could rule England. Each conspiracy bore the mark of Catholic desperation and foreign ambition, a constant reminder that Elizabeth's crown could slip from her head at any moment. Into this web stepped Francis Walsingham, the Queen's spymaster, whose nets of intelligence snared the conspirators one by one. He intercepted letters written by Mary herself, letters urging assassination and rebellion, and he allowed those missives to pass through to the conspirators, building an unassailable case against her. Elizabeth hesitated. Executing a fellow anointed by God was unprecedented, a sacrilege that might undermine the divine right of all monarchs. To slay a queen was to shatter the very foundation of sacred kingship. Yet the evidence could not be ignored. In February of 1587, Elizabeth at last signed the death warrant, sending Mary to the scaffold at Fotheringhay Castle. The execution took place in the bleak morning light. Mary, dignified in crimson velvet, knelt and offered prayers, her head covered by a linen coif, the final contrast of regal poise and mortal vulnerability. The axe fell, and Mary's blood stained the floorboards, echoing through the corridors of power as a warning and a tragedy both. After Mary's demise, Elizabeth's triumph rang hollow. She retreated into a deep and lingering depression, a sorrow that no public triumph could dispel. In the quiet of her private chambers, she locked the doors and refused both pen and paper, turning away from council meetings and banquets. Food lost its taste. Her appetite vanished until she subsisted on weak broths and sips of wine. Her voice, once clear and commanding, fell silent for hours, as if she listened only to the hollow echo of her own thoughts. Courtiers grew anxious. They found her staring at empty tapestries, eyes unfocused, as though she saw ghosts dancing across the walls. They spoke in hushed tones of her pale complexion, the dark circles beneath her eyes, and the tremor in her hands when they gently nudged her awake. She offered no counsel, no comfort. Instead, she lay upon her couch, draped in crimson velvet, her powdered face turned upward toward the candlelight, and let the flames flicker over her grief. During these months, Elizabeth rarely received visitors. Gentlemen in waiting were dismissed after a curt greeting. Ladies of the court stood at rigid attention in the antechamber, yearning for a kind word that never came. Her chaplain, summoned to pray at her side, found her muttering fragments of Latin prayers, as though beseeching forgiveness for a sin too vast to name. When asked if she would counsel her successor or renew her oaths to the realm, she offered only a faint nod, as though too weary to speak. This withdrawal from public life fueled rumours abroad. Spanish envoys reported that England's queen was bewitched by sadness, while French ambassadors speculated that she planned to abdicate and retire to a convent. Members of Parliament whispered that without a monarch's guiding hand, the realm teetered on the brink of chaos. Yet Elizabeth refused to emerge. The death of Mary, once a political necessity, had proven a personal torment. She had slain her own blood, and the guilt weighed upon her like a shroud. Slowly, over months of isolation, Elizabeth's courtiers staged gentle interventions. A favourite lady-in-waiting would begin a song by candlelight, pleading for a note from Elizabeth's lips. A musician would be allowed to play her favourite lute melody in the antechamber, hoping the music might coax her spirit back to life. On rare occasions, the Queen stirred, gazed through the lattice at the moonlit gardens, and whispered a single line of verse about hope or renewal, before drifting back into silence. By late 1587, signs of recovery flickered. Elizabeth summoned her council once more, asking about matters of state in her measured, regal tone. She permitted a brief audience with foreign envoys, offering them a steady gaze and polished courtesy. Though her frame remained frail and her eyes hollow, her presence returned with a quiet intensity, as though forged anew in the crucible of grief. Thus, Mary's execution cast a long shadow over Elizabeth's reign, one that touched the heart of the Queen herself. The act that secured her throne had nearly broken her spirit, and though she would rally to lead England into the age of exploration and into confrontation with the Great Armada, she would forever carry the sorrow of that winter and spring of mourning, when a queen laid low by sorrow became a woman in profound despair. In that dark retreat, Elizabeth discovered the depths of her resilience, learning at last that even a monarch must endure suffering before she can triumph. In 1588, when the shadow of sorrow had barely lifted from her heart, Elizabeth faced a crisis that dwarfed all that had come before: the Spanish Armada. Philip II of Spain assembled 130 ships and 30,000 men-at-arms, joined by Spanish infantry and cavalry poised in the Netherlands, and set sail for England with the purpose of invasion. The very earth trembled at the prospect. In London, the bells tolled incessantly. In ports, the watchmen lit signal beacons along the coast. And among her people, fear rippled like a dark tide. Elizabeth herself, now 54 years old, gaunt from years of illness and lead poisoning, chose that moment to stand before her soldiers at Tilbury. In the early morning mist, as dawn's pale light crept over the fields, Elizabeth was lifted onto her horse by strong arms, for she could no longer mount unassisted. Her ladies-in-waiting formed a human cradle around her, their whispered prayers mingling with the distant rumble of cannon fire. She wore a ceremonial breastplate polished to a mirror shine over a gown of deepest crimson velvet embroidered with gold thread. On her head gleamed a modest steel helmet, and in her hand she carried a white staff, symbols of martial authority and royal dignity entwined. At her side rode Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, whose steady gaze and silent presence lent her courage, though none could see the tremor in her heart. When she reached the front of the muster, the ranks of soldiers fell silent. There, upon a gentle rise, Elizabeth sat astride her white steed, her figure wreathed in the haze of gunpowder and dew. With a clear, ringing voice that carried across the assembled troops, she began her speech. "I know I have the body of a weak, feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too. Let tyrants know that thoughts of invasion bring dishonour and death." Her words echoed like thunder, awakening in each man a fierce loyalty. They cheered until their voices cracked, their cries echoing over the river and through the marshes, as if to say that for England and for Elizabeth they would gladly march into hell itself. The Spanish Armada, however, met a fate more terrible than any army in the field. Bad weather in the Bay of Biscay scattered their ships. Fierce gales off the coast of Cornwall battered their sails and snapped their masts like twigs. English fireships, set ablaze and sent drifting into the enemy fleet, sowed panic that could not be quenched. By the time the surviving galleons limped back towards Spain, damaged and demoralized, the Armada was broken. Across England, bells rang in triumph. Bonfires lit the night sky. And everywhere, people hailed Elizabeth as the Virgin Queen, who had saved her realm by sheer courage and wit. Yet beneath the roar of celebration lay a truth too dire to mention in public. The exertion of her journey to Tilbury, the strain of her ancient ailments, and the lingering effects of lead and corset torture combined to claim a steep toll. Within days, Elizabeth fell grievously ill. She was carried to her bedchamber at Whitehall, where she lay motionless under silken covers for an entire week. Her attendants noted that she suffered excruciating pain in her abdomen, as if her organs had been wrung dry by the corset's unrelenting grip. Her breathing was ragged, her pulse ran wild, and when she spoke, it was only in hoarse whispers. In private letters, her ladies-in-waiting dared to confide their fears. One wrote to a friend that the triumph at Tilbury has cost her life. Her sufferings are beyond measure, yet she forbids any mention of her weakness in court. Another recorded that Her Majesty refused all visitors save for her most trusted physician, who stood endlessly at her bedside, applying poultices of willow bark and wine, though he admitted privately that there was little more to be done. The courtiers, ever mindful of appearances, spread word that her illness was a mild fever, nothing that a fortnight of rest could not cure. But behind closed doors, they wept and prayed for her recovery. Throughout her bedbound week, Elizabeth drifted between fevered delirium and profound exhaustion. She murmured fragments of her Tilbury speech, as though testing whether she had truly spoken those words with such confidence. At times she gazed at the ornate ceiling, her eyes reflecting the flicker of candle flames, and asked, "Is the storm over?" On the fourth day she briefly opened her eyes and stared at a tapestry depicting the defeat of the Spanish, a faint smile crossing her lips before she sank back into unconsciousness. By the seventh day she was too weak even to swallow broth, and her court feared that the cruelty of her own body, battered by decades of royal duty, might finally claim her life. At last, as the heat of spring pressed against the palace walls, Elizabeth's fever broke. Slowly, painfully, she regained enough strength to sit up, then to speak in measured tones. The physicians, astonished, declared her on the mend. Her complexion, though pale, no longer bore the sheen of illness. Her pulse, though weak, had steadied, and the pain, though still present, had abated enough to allow gentle movement. Courtiers exhaled in relief. Ambassadors sent effusive letters of congratulations, and Elizabeth, with her trademark poise, resumed her duties, treading carefully lest she undo her recovery. Thus, the Armada's defeat was secured not only by cannon fire and storm, but by a monarch's willingness to bear unimaginable burdens. Elizabeth returned to her throne, her resolve steeled by the knowledge that even in her frailty she could inspire a nation. Yet the memory of those 7 days of suffering lingered, a silent testament to the hidden costs of power and the profound sacrifices demanded of a queen who would not be broken. The 1990s of Elizabeth's reign ushered in a rapid decline, marked by the loss of those she had loved and trusted most. In 1588, Robert Dudley, her only true passion, her childhood companion, succumbed to abdominal cancer. The news shattered her composed exterior. She barred her chamber doors, refusing sustenance and shunning all company. In her solitude, she clutched the final letter Dudley had penned, its elegant handwriting, a lifeline to memories of laughter and shared confidences. She wore it against her heart, a silent testament to love that outlasted death. Months passed in a haze of mourning, the corridors of Whitehall echoing with her absence. Courtiers whispered that their virgin queen had abandoned her crown for grief, that her singed heart demanded no comfort. Yet one unexpected presence stirred a flicker of life within her. Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, Dudley's adopted son, and a young nobleman of striking charm. Essex was 20 years her junior, handsome, impetuous, and brimming with the fire of youth. When he arrived at court in 1590, bearing news of military campaigns in Ireland and pleas for royal favour, Elizabeth found herself strangely invigorated by his vigour. She bestowed upon him titles and lands, making him Keeper of the Privy Seal and Master of the Horse, seating him prominently in council and in her heart's secret chambers. His rapid rise did not go unnoticed. Both foreign ambassadors and domestic factions speculated on the nature of their bond. Was this a filial affection, the warm regard of a queen for her friend's son, or was it the stirring of a new, albeit more tempered, affection? Elizabeth neither confirmed nor denied their suspicions, preferring to watch the tides of gossip ebb and flow. In Ireland, Essex's campaign faltered disastrously. His bold strategies unravelled amid poor logistics and fierce Gaelic resistance. The Queen's confidence in him, once as steadfast as her resolve at Tilbury, wavered with each failed skirmish. Yet she defended him publicly, railing against those who dared criticise her protégé. In private, however, she felt the sharp sting of disappointment, as if Dudley himself had betrayed her from beyond the grave. The final rupture came on a bitter morning in 1501. Essex, having returned without royal permission and under a cloud of disgrace, stormed into Elizabeth's private chambers. He found her unadorned for the first time in decades. her face bereft of powder and paint, her corset unlaced, her hair loose around her shoulders. There she sat, huddled in a simple gown of grey wool, her eyes hollow with exhaustion. To Essex, accustomed only to the radiant persona of the perfect monarch, the sight was a shock. He stumbled back, his bravado faltering before the raw truth of her aging form. In that instant, Elizabeth felt the deepest stroke of betrayal. The man she had raised, honoured, and perhaps even loved, had perceived her vulnerability and recoiled. She was no longer the transcendent figure forged by lead-white makeup, gilded gowns, and measured rhetoric. She was a woman worn by time, tortured by toxins, and laid bare by treachery. Essex's silence in the face of her ruined beauty wounded her more keenly than any political defeat. Soon thereafter, Essex resolved to seize power. In a desperate gamble, he conspired with a handful of disaffected nobles to march on the court and force councillors to endorse his command. His plan collapsed within hours. Loyal troops dispersed his followers, and Essex found himself under arrest. Elizabeth, torn between her heart's residual affection and her duty to the crown, signed his death warrant. She is said to have wept hot tears as she affixed her signature, "The only man I ever truly loved," she murmured in a private moment of regret, yet her hand did not waver. On the 25th of February in the year 1601, Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, was beheaded on Tower Hill. He was 34 years old. When word reached Elizabeth in her bedchamber, she collapsed into a chair, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The courtiers, accustomed to her stoicism, watched in stunned silence as the Queen's composure dissolved into raw grief. For days, she refused to leave her chamber, refusing counsel, refusing meals, refusing life beyond memory's relentless replay. This final betrayal and execution deepened Elizabeth's melancholy into profound darkness. She withdrew into herself, haunted by the faces of the two Roberts, the one she had loved as flesh and blood, and the one she had nurtured as protégé and son. The earlier lessons of survival of adopting the role demanded by power now felt like cruel ironies. She had become the role she once mastered, and in doing so, had lost what humanity she possessed. Thus, the 1990s closed with Elizabeth a shadow of the Queen who once defied storms and armies alike. Her reign would continue, but the flame of her spirit had dimmed, flickering in the vast chambers of her solitude. The sacrifices demanded by sovereignty, from the poisons hidden in her makeup to the icy steel of her political will, had exacted their final toll, leaving behind a sovereign whose heart had been both her greatest weapon and her most devastating vulnerability. In her final years, Elizabeth's body betrayed her with a relentlessness that few could have imagined. Her teeth had fallen away almost entirely, leaving gaping voids that she concealed by wedging small pieces of cloth into her cheeks to preserve the illusion of a full face. The daily ritual of hair and makeup became a torment of its own. Her natural hair had long since succumbed to the toxic effects of her Venetian soothes, and she was forced to wear enormous wigs piled high with wire frames, pearls, and gold filigree. Each wig weighed heavily upon her temples, provoking headaches that pulsed like distant drums throughout the day. Her hands shook with a tremor reminiscent of Parkinson's disease, whether born of lead poisoning, constant stress, or some mixture of both, no physician could say. She could no longer hold a quill steady for more than a few sentences, and so she relied on secretaries to record her dictated letters. Her eyes, once sharp and commanding, had grown dim. When reading official dispatches, she squinted behind pince-nez lenses, yet always removed them before any formal audience, fearful that spectacles would betray her advancing age to foreign ambassadors and courtly factions. The Queen's chambers were redolent with layered fragrances, sandalwood, ambergris, rosewater perfumes meant to mask the decay within. Even so, servants spoke in hushed tones of an odour they could not vanquish. "Only strong chemicals can fight the stench of true rot," one attendant whispered in a private letter. Another maid later recalled, "There was a dreadful sourness beneath her skirts, something so foul I could scarcely find words." The air seemed to quiver with that hidden stench, merging with incense smoke until the very walls felt saturated with the silent testimony of suffering. Beneath the cobalt velvet of her gowns, Elizabeth's abdomen had swollen grotesquely, resembling the pregnancy of 6 months. Yet the swelling was not life but fluid, trapped by failing kidneys and a liver ravaged by decades of poison. Solid food had become unbearable, She sipped thin broths and small draughts of wine, spiked with stimulating tinctures, just enough to keep her mind from slipping into unconsciousness before the day's audiences. It was a precarious balance. Too little, and she fainted. Too much, and her fragile stomach rebelled with violent cramps. Despite the agony that clenched her insides each morning, Elizabeth maintained the rituals of sovereignty. At sunrise, she would be dressed in layers of brocade and pearls, her counsellors arrayed like knights in waiting. Carried into the presence chamber, she offered a measured nod, a quiet, "Good morrow," and surveyed the assembly with the same unflinching gaze that once rallied armies at Tilbury. No tremor betrayed her pain. No pallor hinted at her weakness. In that moment, she was more than a woman. She was the living embodiment of the Tudor throne, a symbol whose very existence demanded undiminished awe. As the day wore on, every gesture required calculation. When a foreign envoy presented his credentials, she received him with solemn courtesy, allowing no sign of discomfort to mar her bearing. If a minister voiced concerns about war finances or naval expeditions, she nodded thoughtfully, as though her mind were as agile as in youth. In truth, each stretch of her broken body felt like the path of a blade, each breath a labour in narrow chambers of bone. Yet the legend of the Virgin Queen thrived on her silence. At night, the chamber doors were bolted, and her ladies prepared her for rest. The heavy wigs and corsets were removed, though sometimes only half untied, lest the pressure of standing give way to the terror of sitting, and she lay upon a bed piled high with feather-filled pillows. Candles guttered in sconces, casting wavering shadows that danced across the tapestry. Sometimes she whispered fragments of prayers in classical Latin, invoking saints and angels to grant her peace. Other times, she drifted into a fitful sleep, plagued by nightmares of courts filled with smoke and ash, her own face cracking like old porcelain. In those dark hours, she was no longer the unassailable monarch, but a woman in extremis, clinging to life by a thread of stubborn pride. The very instruments of her glory, the pearls, the velvet, the silks, had become shrouds for a body that no longer responded as it once had. Each morning, she rose to greet the court anew, sustaining the myth of invincibility even as her flesh and bone cried for release. As days passed into weeks and weeks into months, the price of power became ever clearer. The throne demanded sacrifices too profound for any mortal to bear without cost. And so, in those waning years, Elizabeth reigned as only she could, with dignity carved from pain, with an iron will that outlasted her vitality, and with a resolve that even the decaying tissues of her weary body could not shatter. She remained the face of England's grandeur, a living testament to the belief that a queen must endure much more than any subject could imagine, and must hide every ache and sorrow behind the mask of sovereign strength. By March of the year 1603, Queen Elizabeth Tudor had entered her final descent into despair. Her counsellors watched with mounting alarm. She had yet to name a successor, and the prospect of dying childless threatened a maelstrom of civil strife and foreign intervention. One by one they presented their lists of claimants: James VI of Scotland, son of the late Mary, Queen of Scots; Arabella Stuart, granddaughter of Catherine Parr; various English nobles whose ambitions could ignite factional warfare. Each name was met with Elizabeth's silence, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the council chamber's tapestries. It was not until the 23rd of March, when her advisers, fearing outright flight into madness, persisted in voicing the name of James, that Elizabeth gave a faint, almost imperceptible nod, an act of consent that rippled through Westminster like a sigh of relief. Yet even in this small concession, she refused to lie down in her royal bed. "If I take to my couch, I shall never rise again," she whispered, her voice frail yet resolute. Courtiers and physicians alike trembled at her words, dreading that she would collapse in the hall and expire before the rites of succession could be performed. That very night, after days in which she could scarcely stand unassisted, Elizabeth faltered as she walked the dimly lit corridor leading to her bedchamber. Strong arms supported her as she was guided into the grand state bed, its canopy embroidered with Tudor roses and mottos of sovereignty. All through that night, she breathed unevenly, each inhalation a drawn-out effort, each exhalation a sigh of exhaustion that seemed to carry the weight of her entire reign. As dawn's first pale light rose on the 24th of March 1603, Elizabeth Tudor's life slipped away without a final farewell. She simply ceased to breathe, leaving her chamber in an eerie hush. The massive oak door was bolted, and guards stationed themselves at intervals in the corridor beyond, permitting only her most trusted ladies to remain within. It was then, in the hush that follows death, that the true horror emerged. Her attendants, in the solemn duty of preparing the body for lying in state, began to remove the layers of heavy lead-white makeup and powdered hair. Below that sumptuous facade lay a visage no painter's brush had ever shown. Flesh blackened by necrosis, ulcerated tissue weeping a foul moisture, and the unmistakable stench of decay so overpowering that even the boldest incense failed to mask it. The corset's iron stays had cut into her flesh for decades, leaving deep grooves carved into her torso like runes on ancient stone. One lady in waiting, overcome by nausea, collapsed in retching convulsions, her skirts damp with fear and sorrow. With grim efficiency, the royal household encased the corpse in lead-lined cloth and sealed it within its coffin before the body could cool completely. By nightfall, courtiers had arranged a lavish funeral proclamation. Trumpets blared, mourning cloaks were donned, and invitations were dispatched for a spectacle of grief and loyalty. All of this unfolded in haste, a desperate attempt to enter the body before any whisper of scandal could unfurl. At the stroke of midnight, the coffin was borne in solemn procession to the vault beneath Westminster Abbey. The key to the chamber door was entrusted to a small cadre of nobles, whose loyalty to James, now King James I of England, could not be questioned. A final ritual lock clicked shut on the door, sealing Elizabeth Tudor's remains and her secrets in darkness. And so it has remained for 4 centuries. Pilgrims and historians have petitioned to open the vault, to peer into the resting place of the last Tudor monarch. But every plea has been denied. They claim respect for the dead, the sanctity of royal burial, the need to preserve the integrity of the tomb. Yet beneath that leaden lid lies more than a queen's bones. It holds the evidence of a body tortured by beauty rituals, by corseted agony, by the poisons of vanity and power. That evidence, like Elizabeth herself, has been entombed in lead, and silence her legacy forever shrouded in the very secrecy that defined her reign. Immediately after Queen Elizabeth Tudor drew her last breath in the early hours of the 24th of March, 1603, the court swung into a frenzy of funeral preparations and concealment. The heavy oak door of her bedchamber was bolted from the outside, and soldiers were posted at intervals along the corridors to ensure that no one could approach the royal corpse. Within, the ladies in waiting braced themselves for the grim task of undressing the body and removing the thick layers of Venetian suze, a lethal mask of white lead and arsenic applied over 4 decades. With trembling hands, they chipped away at the encrusted makeup. Beneath the once pristine surface lay skin that sloughed away in blackened sheets, revealing festering tissue and a stench so rancid that the scented tapestries and burning frankincense could not mask it. The corset worn so tightly over 40 years that it had reshaped her ribs into unnatural angles left gashes and grooves, carved into her torso like runes in stone. Some ribs had fractured under the relentless compression, their ends pressing painfully into decayed flesh. The court's physicians, previously barred from examining the sovereign's body, except under the strictest supervision, were hurried away or quietly dismissed. Within a year, 3 of those who had attended her final hours met sudden and unexplained deaths, their own fates echoing the Queen's hidden torments. Meanwhile, the crown's surgeons worked swiftly but secretly, wrapping her form in thick layers of cloth and lead sheeting before the lime could set and reveal any further decay. No full post-mortem report was ever allowed. Only a single shivering note was entered into the registers. Died after protracted illness. Devoid of any medical detail. Outside the chamber, the pageantry of the funeral unfolded as a grand spectacle designed to awe and distract. Bands of trumpeters blared mournful fanfares, heralding the procession through Whitehall's courtyards. The lords-in-waiting marched in velvet cloaks embroidered with the Tudor rose, their steps synchronized to drumbeats echoing through the stone arches. Standard-bearers displayed the Queen's coat of arms, while officers of arms performed the ritual proclamation, "Here lies Elizabeth, by the grace of God, Queen of England, France and Ireland, defender of the faith, Emsfree." Yet beneath the brass and velvet lay urgency. The court desired to bury the Queen as swiftly as decency would permit, lest rumours of her decayed body metastasize into calls for investigation. Speed was the key. Her coffin, still warm to the touch, was borne on litters draped in black velvet to the entrance of Westminster Abbey. There, in the dim morning light, the dean of the chapel recited prayers and psalms, invoking final rest for Elizabeth's soul and divinity for her memory. At no point did any official record acknowledge the true condition of her remains. Chroniclers wrote of disease and old age as the cause, glossing over the agonies she had endured. The chief herald instructed his officers to focus on her virtues, her wisdom, her valour, her steadfast piety in sermons to the assembled congregation. Even the abbey's crypt records were scrubbed clean of any hint of scandal, preserving only the date of interment and her regal titles. Once the funeral rite concluded, her tomb was sealed beneath iron-bound stone. The lead-lined coffin descended into the underground vault, which was then barred and secured with multiple locks, each key entrusted to a different high-ranking noble. The stairwell was hidden behind a false wall of marble, leaving no signpost to the chamber below. A final layer of inscriptions on the vault door spoke only of her glorious reign and her benevolence to the realm, maintaining the myth of unblemished majesty. And so, for 4 centuries, Elizabeth's physical truth lay entombed in lead and secrecy. Scholars and petitioners have since sought to open her vault to examine the body that for so long held the answer to questions of her health, her alleged conditions, and the very nature of her death. Yet every request was rebuffed in the name of reverence for the dead and the inviolability of royal burial. The vault remains sealed, its mysteries locked within the heavy stone, guarding the Queen's final secret, the extent to which power, vanity, and fear coalesced into a life, and a death hidden beneath layers of makeup, lead, and silence. After the funeral rites, Queen Elizabeth Tudor's remains were sealed forever within a cold lead coffin, interred deep beneath the hallowed floors of Westminster Abbey. For 4 centuries, no petition to open her sarcophagus has ever been granted. In 1952, during the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II, British historians and several universities submitted formal requests to exhume the Tudor Queen's body. Each was refused without detailed explanation. Then in 1975, when non-invasive CT scanning technology had advanced sufficiently to allow a respectful examination from the outside, another proposal was lodged and again denied, the official rationale invoking reverence for the deceased. In 2003, on the 400th anniversary of her death, an international appeal backed by medical scholars, archaeologists, and cultural historians sought a controlled examination of her remains. Yet once more, the petition met a firm rebuff. Meanwhile, other royal burials have been treated far less mysteriously. The skeleton of King Richard III was unearthed in 2012, subjected to DNA analysis, carbon dating, and full skeletal assessment. The tombs of King Henry VI and Queen Catherine of Aragon have been opened for study. Even medieval remains far older have been investigated to glean insights into diet, health, and lineage. But Elizabeth Tudor's entombment stands as the one absolute exception to this pattern. Every request to peer beneath the lead lid has been met with the same official invocation of sanctity and preservation. Yet among scholars, doubt persists. What exactly is being preserved? Is it truly the Queen's dignity, as the Royal Commission claims, or the enduring myth of the Virgin Queen, an icon whose untouchable purity still undergirds the very idea of monarchical power in Britain? Each refusal, while couched in respectful language, deepens suspicions that the state fears the revelations a scientific study might yield. If the body were ever examined properly, the medical evidence of centuries of poisoning, corset-induced deformity, and possible intersex traits could come to light, facts that might shatter the carefully curated legend of a monarch who chose steadfast virginity for the sake of her realm. Requests to access Elizabeth's vault have tended to follow major historical anniversaries or technological milestones. Yet the answer has always been the same. No, out of respect for the deceased and the sanctity of her final resting place. Even advocates for non-destructive imaging have been turned away. In contrast, whenever a high-profile medieval burial has been proposed for study, the same authorities have granted permission, citing the public interest in historical knowledge. Why then does Elizabeth's tomb remain locked? The unspoken implication is that some truths are deemed too dangerous to disturb. In academic conferences and journal articles, experts debate the possibilities. Could a digital ground-penetrating radar survey reveal the coffin's exact placement without opening it? Might fiber-optic endoscopes be threaded through old mortar joints to capture internal images? Each technical suggestion is considered, then quietly shelved, as if the very act of discussion risks transgressing a boundary set by centuries of tradition. And so the Queen's sarcophagus sits silent. Guarded by more than just iron and stone, it is protected by the weight of legend, by the inertia of royal protocol, and by an unspoken vow to keep certain secrets forever buried. Tourists visiting the abbey walk over the vault's concealed entrance without knowing what lies beneath their feet. They pass over the resting places of kings and queens, some studied in detail, others left to myth. But it is the unresolved enigma of Elizabeth Tudor that captures the imagination. The possibility that beneath the polished ledger stone lies evidence of a body sacrificed to political necessity, of a woman who endured pain and concealment as acts of statecraft. These hidden truths hover under the abbey's arches, present in every hushed corridor conversation and every forbidden scholarly proposal. In the end, the persistence of refusal elevates the tomb itself into an artifact of power. The lead-sealed coffin becomes both a literal and symbolic barrier between history and myth, science and reverence, the flesh of a long-dead queen and the ideals she embodied. 4 centuries have passed, and still the key to her vault remains beyond reach, its secret protected by vaults of royal decree rather than laboratory walls. The legend of the Virgin Queen endures unchallenged, preserved in lead, in silence, and in the steadfast refusal of every request to look behind the mask that time itself has been unable to erase. So what makes Queen Elizabeth Tudor's remains such an enigmatic no-man's land? First, she stands as the living embodiment of monarchical power and patriotic devotion, the immortal queen refined through hundreds of portraits, countless Shakespearean dramas, and a steady stream of propagandistic chronicles, exposing the true state of her mummy-blackened flesh corroded by necrosis. Ribcage grooves carved by a lifetime of corsetry torture would shatter the legend of her timeless, indomitable rule. The very idea of uncovering her decayed corpse conflicts with the image of a sovereign who transcended mortality, a woman upheld as eternal by paintings that show no wrinkle, by plays that immortalize her wit, and by histories that praise her unblemished virtue. Second, foreign ambassadors from Spain, the Vatican, France, and the Netherlands all meticulously recorded their impressions of Elizabeth's unusual appearance. They remarked upon her tall, statuesque frame, her unusually low voice, and her bearing that many described as masculine. Some envoys noted the absence of any sign of childbearing, which was a critical factor for potential marriage alliances. If her tomb were opened, the medical evidence buried with her would likely confirm suspicions of androgen insensitivity syndrome or another intersex condition. Such a revelation would not merely offer a footnote in medical history, it would topple long-standing assertions of her legitimacy. After all, the Tudor line had survived on the assertion that she had chosen virginity over motherhood. If it became clear that she could never have borne children, the entire narrative of her reign built upon conscious sacrifice would unravel, raising uncomfortable questions about the foundations of succession she set in motion. Finally, the myth of Elizabeth Tudor as the self-anointed Virgin Queen, an icon whose power needed no husband, has been woven into the very fabric of British national identity. To admit that her chastity was not a deliberate political choice, but a consequence of bodily difference would feel akin to demolishing a sacred statue. The monarchy in England has long depended on the perception of divine sanction and miraculous exceptionality. A revelation that Elizabeth's virginity was not by choice but by biology would undercut the notion that she was uniquely favoured by Providence, a woman anointed to lead alone. It would force a re-examination of the ideological underpinnings of the crown, perhaps suggesting that her reign was less a triumph of personal will and more a product of medical accident and political necessity. Imagine the cascade of consequences. Art historians questioning the authenticity of every post-maturity portrait, biographers revising chapters that celebrate her deliberate rejection of marriage, legal scholars debating whether, had her bodily reality been known, Parliament could have accepted her sole rule. The monarchy's mystique relies on symbols more than statutes. The crown, the sceptre, the oath to uphold the realm. Elizabeth's persona as the Virgin Queen was the ultimate symbol, unblemished by personal scandal and unthreatened by the prospect of a rival heir. If that symbol were punctured by science, the entire edifice of royal sanctity might seem built on a lie. Moreover, there is an emotional dimension that transcends political theory. For 4 centuries, generations of Britons have grown up with the image of a sovereign who stood alone, her power unmediated by a husband or male regency. She became a cultural touchstone, the subject of poems, of plays, of ballads sung in taverns and cathedral crypts alike. Parents taught their children of her steadfast courage, her heart of a king, her refusal to yield. To disturb her remains would feel to many like desecrating a national totem, like tearing down a monument that has stood for ages, offering inspiration and identity. This fear of undermining symbols explains why every modern appeal from scientists seeking non-invasive CT scans in 1975 to international coalitions pressing for a 400th anniversary study in 2003 has been met with the same official refrain, out of respect for her memory and the sanctity of her resting place. Yet one cannot help but observe a curious inconsistency. Richard III's skeleton was exhumed, his remains DNA, tested and CT scanned. Henry VI and Catherine of Aragon have been examined. Medieval burials even older have been disturbed for the sake of knowledge. Only Elizabeth's tomb remains inviolable. It is as though her coffin, sealed in lead and interred beneath Westminster Abbey's vaulted arches, functions not only as a burial chamber, but as a firewall between myth and truth. The consensus among the royal commissioners seems to be that certain historical narratives must be preserved at all costs, even if it means consigning scientific inquiry to the footnotes. Perhaps they fear that shining the unforgiving light of forensic evidence on her remains would cast long shadows over the institution she so carefully supported. So, the tomb remains sealed. No CT probe, no endoscopic camera, no ground-penetrating radar survey is permitted to pierce the perpetual silence. Visitors tread over her hidden vault, unaware of the secrets buried beneath their feet. In the hush of the abbey's interior, the lead-lined coffin rests in darkness, shielding not only a body, but a centuries-old pact. That some truths, however tantalizing, are too dangerous to unearth, and some symbols too precious to risk tarnishing. The immortal queen lives on in lead and legend, her flesh entombed, her mystery intact, preserved by the unyielding power of the myths she inspired. To this day, Queen Elizabeth Tudor's remains lie sealed beneath layers of lead, untouched by the probing hands of scientists, archaeologists, or historians. Every formal request to peer inside her coffin with non-invasive imaging, to conduct an endoscopic survey, to employ the latest ground-penetrating radar, has been categorically denied. International conferences have debated the moral and scholarly imperative. Petitions have been signed by luminaries in forensic pathology and medieval history alike, and every appeal has met the same resolute refusal, out of respect for her memory and the sanctity of her final resting place. This absolute prohibition has transformed Elizabeth's tomb into something more than a repository of bones. It has become a living symbol of the power of myth. In an age when interdisciplinary collaboration between science and history can illuminate the past in unprecedented detail, the refusal to examine her remains seems almost deliberate, an act of willful preservation of legend at the expense of empirical truth. The question arises, are the political and cultural values embodied by Elizabeth Tudor deemed more precious than the knowledge that modern medicine and archaeology might uncover? Many voices argue that the stakes extend far beyond academic curiosity. The image of the Virgin Queen, unbowed and unmarred by personal scandal, is inextricably woven into Britain's national identity. It fuels tourism, inspires stage and screen productions, and underpins educational curricula from London to the farthest reaches of the Commonwealth. The monarchy itself draws legitimacy from a lineage of ritual, ceremony, and unbroken continuity elements reinforced by the enduring enigma of Elizabeth's unexamined coffin. The suggestion that her chastity may have been a medical necessity rather than a deliberate vow, or that her final suffering was the result of centuries of toxic cosmetics, threatens to crack the facade of invulnerability that has served as the crown's most potent symbol. Financial concerns also loom large. The cost of a meticulously controlled exhumation, if permission were granted, would undoubtedly run into the millions of pounds. Conservationists would demand state-of-the-art climate-controlled facilities to prevent further degradation of the remains. Insurance underwriters would balk at covering the venture, given the potential for irreversible damage. Meanwhile, the political fallout could prove even more costly. A scandal centered on a revered queen might inflame Republican sentiment, fracture public trust in the institution, and give ammunition to critics who view the monarchy as an archaic relic. In academic circles, the debate is intense, yet largely relegated to private correspondence and specialist journals. Proponents of exhumation emphasize the scientific benefits: confirmation of historical theories about royal health, clarification of Tudor succession, and the opportunity to apply modern forensic methods to a figure whose reign shaped an era. Opponents counter that consent cannot be given when the subject is long deceased, that disturbing a sacred tomb violates deeply held cultural norms, and that some secrets are better left interred. Cultural stakeholders add their own arguments. Theatrical producers fear a loss of mystique that drives interest in Shakespeare's Elizabethan settings. Museum curators worry that the revelation of unpleasant medical details will dampen visitor enthusiasm for Tudor period exhibits. Even culinary tourism-themed afternoon teas, heritage ales named after the Queen, relies on the romanticized version of Elizabeth rather than the painful reality beneath her lead-lined coffin. In short, the economy built around her story stands to lose its most lucrative asset if the truth emerges. Yet in the corridors of power, few dare challenge the status quo. To do so would risk being branded unpatriotic or irreverent, traits no one in the establishment wishes to embody. The Royal Commission entrusted with her affairs has consistently deferred to tradition, citing continuity of respect as a higher principle than scholarly inquiry. Even legislators in Parliament have shied away from proposing motions that might compel an investigation, mindful that any law forcing an exhumation would face vehement backlash. As the 21st century advances, one wonders how much longer this moratorium can endure. Science marches on, with imaging technologies that could peer through lead as effectively as through flesh, and molecular techniques capable of retrieving DNA from minute fragments. Public attitudes toward privacy and historical accountability evolve too, with greater emphasis on transparency and the democratization of knowledge. Yet Elizabeth Tudor's coffin remains a fortress of silence, a sealed testament to the enduring power of legend over fact. Perhaps one day the fortress walls will crack, if only under the steady pressure of a new generation's insistence on seeing history unvarnished. Until then, the Queen's remains her necrotic flesh, her rib bones grooved by corset torture, the toxins that course through her veins stay locked away beneath Westminster Abbey. In that tomb, myth and memory intertwine, preserving not only a body, but a centuries-old pact, that some truths are deemed too perilous to disturb, and that the sanctity of power may demand a secrecy as deep and impenetrable as the lead that guards it. And so we come to the gentle close of our tale, drifting away from candles and corridors, leaving behind the heavy stones and whispered secrets that have lingered in the shadowed halls of history. Imagine now the hush of dawn breaking over Westminster Abbey, soft light filtering through stained glass to rest upon a bed of petals, each one a promise that time, even time so relentless, will always yield to healing. The weight of power, the ache of sacrifice, the layers of paint and corset that held a queen aloft, all these images dissolve now like mist at sunrise, dissolving into the quiet reassurance that every story, no matter how dark or intricate, must one day give way to peace. Our journey through those centuries has shown us the paradox of strength and vulnerability, reminding us that glory often demands a price, and that behind every legend is a human heart, beating with hopes and fears not so different from our own. If there is a single message to carry with you as you close your eyes tonight, let it be that the greatest power lies not in invulnerability, but in the courage to endure, to stand firm when the world demands your unwavering presence, yet to know when to lay down your burdens and simply rest. Take comfort, then, in the knowledge that even the mightiest have known exhaustion, that every facade eventually softens, and that behind every storied mask there is the possibility of grace. As you let these final images fade, the corridors emptied of soldiers, the lead-lined coffin sealed in darkness, the hush of ancient stone, I invite you to release whatever weight you may carry, to breathe deeply, and to allow your own heart to find its quiet rhythm. May this moment be your sanctuary, a pause in the whirlwind of days, where the echoes of history become a lullaby rather than a summons, where you are free to drift beyond the past and into a realm of soft repose. And when sleep claims you, may you dream gently of renewal, waking with the light conviction that every dawn brings a fresh beginning. every breath a chance to live with both strength and tenderness. Thank you for joining me on this voyage through memory, myth, and mystery. If you found comfort in our shared reverie, if these stories stirred something deep within your own spirit, I hope you will linger here a little longer. Subscribe to our channel and awaken to many more tales that soothe, inspire, and invite reflection. Until then, sleep well, dream sweetly, and know that the softest whispers often carry the truest truths. Good night.